Ready? It is October 9th. October 9th, 2018. This is a work session. This is phase 2, or our second meeting of our overall budget priorities work session. And without further ado, we'll just jump right back in. Good morning.
Good morning, Mayor, Council. For the record, my name is Tom Reinhardt, Chief Administrative Officer for the city. We are excited to be with you 2 weeks in a row to discuss your budget priorities, and I'm grateful for the colleagues here at the table and the many people that have been working with us on this effort. Last week, we began the discussion of your budget priorities grounded in what has happened with the city's finances over the past several years, namely unprecedented revenue growth, significant increases in personnel costs, investments in critical infrastructure needs like roads, parks, and civic assets, and finally, creation of new services in response to the homelessness and housing crises. As we move forward together, the mayor has asked us to work collaboratively on an approach that helps the council identify priorities earlier in the year. Over the next several years, we hope this effort brings more consistency, predictability, and transparency. Pardon me, I missed that slide. In order to more effectively serve all Portlanders. Just so we're prepared for what is ahead today, we have 3 goals for our time together. First, we will continue the discussion about your priorities, guided by what we know about our current economic conditions, which is why our esteemed city economist is here. As the mayor said a couple times last week, the more we are clear about priorities and outcomes, the easier it will be to create a predictable, stable system with a long-term approach for achieving council's goals for the city. Second, in response to the conversation and questions last week, CBO leadership will outline the directives to develop approach for budget requests this year. And third, Sukri, Director of the Office of Community and Civic Life, will present her team's ideas for beginning to shift the way we engage the community regarding the budget. So let's jump in. I'm going to turn it over to Josh to do the current economic conditions.
All right, thanks. Figures. All right, thanks, Tom. Again, for the record, Josh Harwood, city economist. I will be brief. You will hear plenty from me next month when we do a formal budget retreat, and then the forecast will come out in December. As we move to just sort of set the scene for the next 6 months or so and where we are right now. Assuming we make it to next June, we'll have the longest economic expansion since World War II. So I imagine we'll get there without a recession. And so we've got down 96 actually consecutive months of job growth, also a record. The way to think about our local economy in general, and this is true in this expansion and in others, is that we do better than the nation in good times and we do worse in bad times. So we're a little more volatile than the nation as a whole as an economic entity. We have the lowest unemployment rate on record right now, recorded. What? 3.8%. And so it is. It fluctuates around 3.5, between 3.5 and 4 for about the last year. We do expect the construction sector, for a variety of reasons, to slow over the next year. The conditions for lending, as well as interest rates and a variety of construction-related costs have exceeded the ability to make money in some of these projects. So I would expect to see that slow down a little bit over the next 12 months. As we move to the next slide, a little bit of a look at what our revenue picture looks like. So this is a very simplistic view of where we are relative to our long-run trend. And essentially, as Tom mentioned, our record revenue growth has pushed us well above our long-term trend, about $40 million above our long-term trend. So even a small slowdown could yield some rather large deficit numbers, especially considering that our volatile revenue sources, business license taxes and transient lodging taxes, now make up just about a third of our total general fund revenue picture. As comparison, going into the last recession, it made up about a quarter. So we're more dependent on our volatile revenue sources. That means that even a more modest slowdown could yield similar budget constraints. And finally, just a little bit sort of at the broad outlook, I think the consensus is that we are the economy should keep growing for the next 12 months or so at least. We're decent at predicting the next 12 to 18 months. It gets harder when it gets further out for a variety of reasons. But the tax cut stimulus at the federal level has really created a bit of a monkey wrench in a lot of forecasting on both sort of a macroeconomic scale, but also as it relates to our local revenue sources. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Business license taxes are sort of, I don't want to minimize this, they're sort of an afterthought for large corporations, our business license taxes. It's a very small proportion of what their overall tax liability is. So when the federal law changes occur, it can yield behavioral changes for our highest end taxpayers in that particular revenue stream. And what this particular tax cut did is it provided an incentive for companies to essentially pay their taxes early to other non-federal entities because they could deduct it on the higher federal tax rates before the lower tax rates went into effect. What that does is, and we don't know the magnitude of this yet. I'm working with my counterparts at the county. We're trying to get a sense of what the magnitude is. But qualitatively, it means that some revenue that we would have seen this year actually came in last year. And so that's something we're going to be working through over the next few months to try to gauge sort of the magnitude of it. The other thing that's happening locally, within blocks of here, in fact, is the massive increase in hotel construction in the central city. About 30% more hotel rooms will come online over a course of a 4 or 5 year period. That supply chain will outstrip the demand change. As a result, we expect room rates to fall slightly. And because we apply a rate to the tax, to the room rates, we apply a tax rate to the room rates. The lower room rates would suppress lodging taxes a little bit. And we've already seen that to some extent. Over the last year, we've had a couple quarters that are year over year were actually declines. Very modest ones, but they're actually declines. So those things in combination with a relatively high inflationary environment, which is the other thing we're seeing locally here, will put some budget constraints on us even if we continue our economic growth. And so I'm happy to answer questions. Like I said, we'll be back in front of you a couple times over the next couple months, but I'm happy to answer some questions before we hand it back to Tom.
I had a question on that last comment you made. So in order to accommodate the increasing supply of hotel rooms, people are going to be discounting significantly, and your expectation is even though, well, I guess the question I should be asking is really about demand. Is demand staying relatively stable for hotel rooms, so there's just more hotel rooms and the same level of demand, meaning
broadly
the
speaking,
discounting will lead to less revenues? Or
broadly speaking, Mayor, yeah, the growth in supply is outstripping the growth in demand. So demand can grow a little bit, but we're having a massive increase in supply of hotel rooms here. And so I have some contacts to their general managers of hotels locally, and they're anticipating higher competition for those customers, which will require lower room rates.
Very good, thank you.
I think once the convention center hotel comes online, then we will be getting more bigger conventions. And so I think that there's kind of a gap in the interim.
Yeah, Commissioner Fritz, that's absolutely true. I mean, there's a reason they're building all these hotels, right? It's a long play for those companies. It's not a short-term sort of like try to capitalize on something. So the overall sort of trend is still positive. It's just that we're going to have a little bit of an unsteady blip before we get there.
So if hotels are less expensive in Portland, Oregon, and right now they're considered fairly expensive, right?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that suggest more people would come here? People who, at least at the margin, ordinarily wouldn't come here? Number one. And number two, if they're paying less on their lodging here, does that suggest maybe they'll have more discretionary cash to invest in other things like restaurants or clothing or other goods they might find here?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Obviously but I think the data has shown already, we had massive growth in lodging taxes. We're still seeing more customers come through the airport, but we're not seeing the growth in lodging taxes. So,
and then just to state the obvious, we of course don't capture sales tax outside of the lodging.
Right. I would like it just for the data, but that's just me. All right. Thanks.
Thanks, Josh. So before Interim Budget Director Claudio Campuzano goes through some lists from last week and engages you more in the priorities, we wanted to give you a brief overview of what we heard from you last week, broadly speaking. So the priorities that we heard, when we grouped all the different items in the discussion last week, were really in 4 categories, and they probably won't be surprising to you. Infrastructure, housing investments, homelessness response, and long-term liabilities.
There were 2 more
There were a few
also
outside.
discussed.
These are generally speaking, most of them could fall into these categories. Yes,
Okay, well,
Mr. Mayor.
I don't want public safety or livability to fall off the lists.
And you will see that in the upcoming list that Mr. Campuzano will go through.
And you heard from at least 2 of us that parks are a big priority.
Right, and again, we tried to group them. Parks infrastructure, we're definitely within that first bullet point. So this is not,
It's actually more than infrastructure, it's parks staffing.
and
which
we
is
will
what
go
you
through
heard
that
from-
with you.
from 2
What
of
we
us.
tried to capture was in ongoing attempts to try to get themes from the council, and we can add to this as we go along. But the more that we get on direction and themes, the easier it is for us to collaborate bureau to bureau and come up with proposals for you, Commissioner Fritz and Mr. Mayor. So without any more
So,
questions on that?
I just want to comment that I went to the City Club debate on Friday between the 2 candidates for City Council, and they were asked, given that police, fire, and parks take up the majority of the biggest general fund bureaus, would you cut any of them? And the answer was no from Commissioner Smith, and I would, Joanne Hardesty said that she would cut police and give to parks. So to the extent that our new colleague is not yet at the table, I just wanted to put that on the record.
Thank you. Claudio.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Josh, morning, Council. I'm Claudio Campuzano, Interim Director for the City Budget Office. I think Tom has done a great job capturing some of the big themes that we heard last week, issues that have become really familiar over the last couple of years. And Josh provided some good context for our capacity to address some of those issues in the coming years. As we start to dive a little deeper into the budget process, sort of connecting those priorities to the new investments that we might want to make, I just wanted to take a moment to provide Council really with a summary of the list of some of the big items that CBO has been tracking, things that we as a city have committed to, aspirations that we've signaled through plans that have been passed by Council, and just other statements of intent to make sure that we're giving air to a lot of the issues that have come up over the last year or so. So forgive me if I haven't captured everything, or if the things that are here don't yet rise to the level of priority for this discussion. It's really just intended to seed the discussion about which priorities we do want to focus on in the current year, and how do we tee ourselves up to address some additional challenges in the years going forward. So actually, no, we're good here. So starting with the list of ongoing commitments that we've made or signaled explicitly, I want to start with 2 items from last year's budget. Parks currently receives $2.4 million on an annual basis for major maintenance and replacement of its assets. It is generally understood that this figure is insufficient to maintain the system, and last year Council directed Parks to request an additional $500,000 ongoing each year until such time as they've sort of reached a level of stability. Then second is in order to fund the work necessary to comply with the Creek settlement, PBOT was directed to request a current appropriation level target adjustment of $1 million in the fall bump, and they've done that, and Council will have an opportunity to approve that in the coming weeks. At the same time, Council acknowledged the many barriers to accessibility in the parks system and directed Parks to make a similar $1 million CAL adjustment request. Excuse me. Next up, financial policy requires that a funding plan be in place for any new assets that are anticipated in the next, to be brought online or to be contracted for in the next fiscal year. So Parks is still in the process of developing their O&M estimate for the work that's in their CIP, but early estimates put it above $700,000 annually. So finally, as work on the Portland building and related investments in downtown office space move forward, there are a number of additional costs that need to be incorporated either with new funding from the tenant bureaus or absorbed by those bureaus.
Can I ask you a
Yeah.
question just for the parking lot?
Yeah.
And at the end, I'll probably give you more, but while it's on my mind. Some of these are going to need to be funded regardless of economic circumstances. Could we start making a parking lot list of commitments that will have to be funded regardless of what the status of our revenue structure is, or regardless of what the economy is doing?
Yeah, I think that you're
'Cause
getting.
I'd like to start
Yeah, you're
planning
getting
for our
directly
next
to the
shock.
heart of the goal of developing sort of a citywide financial plan, particularly for the general fund, that really starts to not just identify and size some of these issues, but really log them and make sure that we're tackling them and coming up with a resourcing plan for those things. Yeah, absolutely. The $2 million figure there is the blend. It's a blended figure that includes the blended rate impacts for all downtown office space. It's got the space optimization project in it that's related to the Portland Building project, and debt service for 4th and Montgomery, which is a project that council is directed to move forward. So to the degree that the forecast allows, these items would really need to be accommodated within the 1920 budget, or accommodated in future years through reductions or additional resource. So let's see. So we've got a bunch of other things that we know are out there. So while those were some of the specific commitments that we've made, this next list is a bit squishier. It represents things we know about but haven't yet fully committed to in the form of a funding plan. So this gets a little bit to what the mayor was talking about. It's really not comprehensive. It is really the intent is to start a discussion about what's on here and what's missing, and really figuring out what we want to start resourcing in 1920 and beyond. So Jessica's going to talk a little bit later about directives to develop. We discussed them a little bit in the last session. I just wanted to take a moment to make the concept a little bit more concrete. The previous slide really consists of items that we as staff kind of consider to have been directed. There have been explicit actions on the part of council that have really set those things in motion. This slide is more focused on those areas where we have heard interest or as staff have identified risks or issues, and where we're really looking for direction to develop specific decision points for council in the budget process. And as we develop, so that we can really develop that long-term financial plan and figure out what are we going to tackle in 1920, what are we going to tackle in future years. So when we look at this, the first of the 4 items on the left are commonly referred to as legacy or long-term liabilities. I think they're reasonably well understood. I won't go into them too deeply, but currently there is no comprehensive funding strategy to address them. We've taken a lot of small and large steps on all of them, and really taking a very entrepreneurial and opportunistic approach. But with council direction, my team would work with the CFO and the relevant bureaus to identify, size, and plan for some of these costs, and really tee up a series of decisions for council on how to resource those plans. The likely result would be additional constraints placed on operating bureaus in future years, either by claiming that first new dollar in, or potentially driving reductions to the degree that we don't have those resources, or getting more entrepreneurial in terms of developing resources outside the general fund. So any questions or concerns on that?
Question about the Housing Bureau.
Yeah.
In out years, there is some degree of housing. I think only $3 million of the Housing Bureau is currently funded with the general fund. Mm-hmm. So the remainder is coming from other sources. One of those key other sources is tax increment financing.
That's correct.
We've talked a lot about Prosper Portland going off the TIF cliff. We have not talked a lot about the Housing Bureau following them off that cliff. Why is it not on the list?
You could certainly add it to the list. As I mentioned, this is not a
Shouldn't it be on the list?
I'm sorry?
Shouldn't it be on the list? If housing is one of our priorities,
I think,
and we believe the revenue structure is going to dry up, why isn't it on the list?
We can certainly add it to the list. I know that it's not currently on the list because what I've been trying to capture with this is those things that have been specifically raised by council in recent years. I think that it is something that the TIF cliff is something that I know that we've been concerned with for quite some time, and work with PDC, now Prosper Portland, to work through their plan. So happy to work with the Housing Bureau. I know that they have a number of other resources as well, which wasn't so much the case for Prosper, but we would absolutely continue to work with them to address that.
I know Shannon's here somewhere, but I would like a deeper commentary on the status of the Housing Bureau, particularly with regard to tax increment financing.
Claudio, if I may?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Mr. Mayor, I know that the Chief Financial Officer, Jennifer Cooperman, is working hard with bureaus on their 5-year plans. So I will make sure that Jennifer and Shannon work with our team in terms of giving you an update on that. People are aware of this issue, and we'll update you and the rest of the council.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So the next item at the bottom on the left there, permanent supportive housing, is something that we've heard quite a bit of discussion about as one of the key areas for addressing homelessness. And so really the question is, for 1920 and beyond, do we want to develop size and plan for any significant new investment there? As the rental registration program gets up and running, we've got an amount that's been identified by the Revenue Division as being necessary for collecting those fees. We've got a low confidence number, but it still hasn't been determined what the appropriate level of cost recovery would be for that program. So it is possible that it might be fully self-supporting in the future. Next up, we've got Portland Building Technology. The reconstruction project is intending to absorb the initial deployment of audiovisual, meeting room, print management, and signage technology. But as part of the fall bump, OMF has requested about $500,000 be added to General Fund Bureau current appropriation level targets to fund the ongoing costs associated with this technology enhancement. So the question for council is this something that we want to provide additional resource to General Fund Bureaus for, or ask bureaus to absorb it when those costs come online in 2021?
I'm sorry, are those ongoing?
Yeah, the $500,000 would be ongoing costs. That's associated with the maintenance and replacement reserves for those technology items. So the next one is 311 integration. This is really in its early stages. We don't really have a good sense of what the costs are going to be or how they might be spread across participating bureaus, but really just wanted to get it on the radar as something that council has signaled that we're looking to move forward. And really the last three items are related to labor costs. Both Bureau of Emergency Communications and Portland Fire Bureau, Portland Fire and Rescue will be negotiating new contracts that will ultimately start on July 1. In addition to any potential costs that are associated with these agreements, we've also heard that BOEC might be looking to enhance staffing to achieve their performance targets. This might in turn drive facility needs as they expand, so that might be an additional cost. And really, so the question that we're looking to answer is: are we looking for options in 1920 or beyond to scale up that emergency response?
Not on the list is pay equity. Should that be on the list?
Yes, absolutely, and that's something that we'll be discussing in the fall bump in the next couple of weeks. Yep. So finally, a few weeks ago, Council passed the new non-represented classification and compensation plan. This new class comp plan expands the ranges for non-represented staff. While the plan doesn't have specific costs associated with it, Council did express some desire to manage the near-term pressures related to the fact that there are so many employees that are currently paid at top of range and their potential growth. So that's an item that we've got out there. So before we move on to the next slide, just wanted to see if there are any questions or concerns, and as the mayor's already identified, are there any missing items? All right. So moving on to the one-time list, let's see. So just one thing, I'll note that it is impossible to address all the issues that we've just listed with existing resources or near-term growth in the general fund. So we're really looking to be selective about what we tackle. One of the big challenges moving forward will be developing a more robust financial plan, as I mentioned to the mayor earlier, that really identifies the full cost for these and other risks and issues, and really tees up for council funding solutions and trade-offs. So the next slide that we've got, it really talks about some of the one-time commitments. We talked briefly last week about the Mount Tabor agreement, so unless there are any questions on that, I'll move on. Next, the Anderson settlement is the amount remaining for reimbursing utilities for costs that were deemed inappropriately funded through rates.
I'm sorry, how many more payments are due on the Mount Tabor?
This would be the last one that's required by the agreement.
Very good, thank you.
Let's see. Full reimbursement of that $7 million is required by September 2019. I've got the full amount up here, but we do have $400,000 ongoing in the budget to finance a portion of this. So the ongoing remainder would be in the $3 to $4 million range. This is a possibility of fully funding it with one time and recapturing the $400,000 ongoing as part of the budget process. So I did want to put that out there. The amount that we've got for the joint office reflects a continued commitment for all non-capital one-time that was included in the 18-19 budget. Services include diversion, supportive housing, rapid rehousing, safety off the streets, and system support services. So the next one, in September, Council directed bureaus to enter into commitments related to the lent stabilization. Costs have yet to be determined, although there was about a $250,000 request in the special appropriations budget in the fall to support the management of that program. And so we're looking at that right now, and we'll provide a recommendation to Council shortly. Then those last two space-related items are the required cash contribution per city debt policy for those two projects. I'll note that the general fund component of those could be less depending on the tenancy, but we're just assuming general fund bureaus at this point. So any questions?
Claudia, just to be clear, Council, 4th and Montgomery, the name has changed a couple times. It used to be referred to as the Jasmine Block, just so people are clear about the project.
I'm sorry, I missed what you said about the Joint Office of Homeless Services. So up to 6.6 million, and that's the delta on one-time funding we need to continue where we are?
That's all the one-time funding for non-capital items. There was a capital component in this year's budget that brought it to 7 and change. That was for shelter development. So we were assuming that it was the service component that was the ongoing need.
So if we want to maintain the level of funding of the joint office, we've got to come up to 6.6 million, but that's one time. So there's the second issue, which is how much of that do we want to convert to ongoing?
I think that is absolutely a question for Council. Yeah.
Okay.
So in addition, there's some other one-time items that we've heard about from Council or are otherwise out on the horizon. The first is an ADU pilot, accessory dwelling unit pilot that's been requested in the fall bump. The goal of the program is really to accelerate ADU development with a focus on developing affordable units. So next we've got...
The Council hasn't weighed in on that yet.
I'm sorry,
The Council hasn't weighed in on that.
No, absolutely not. I was just noting that it is, to the degree that we're trying to ventilate those priorities of all of Council, I'm trying to make sure that we're getting a complete list on the table. To the degree that there are things that are missing that are priorities, we definitely want to hear them, but I want to make sure that we've got those things that we've heard about out there. Yeah, absolutely.
I just wanted to add one point to that. It has come up over and over again in my first 2 years in this role that we need to do a better job as the staff to making sure that the Council understands no matter what juncture in the year a funding commitment falls into, what its implications are for the budget process. And that's one of the intentions in this effort, is to make sure that no matter when you make a commitment, whether it's to 4th and Montgomery or a pilot, that you understand what it might be doing in terms of the entire process as a whole. So that's the intent of trying to put these things out early for you, Commissioner Fritz.
Yeah, thank you. So the next one, in June, Council passed a resolution that has a number of costs that we should be expecting, including some foregone tax revenue, pool of resources for building owners to assess their structures with regard to unreinforced masonry, and also costs associated with technical assistance in terms of dealing with those buildings. Next up, as we prepare for the 2020 decennial census, Office of Community and Civic Life has asked for resources to do outreach, particularly for communities that are traditionally undercounted in the census. Southwest, and that's also something that you'll be seeing in the fall bump, and has additional components in out years. So you'll be seeing that in our reviews, and it'll be coming to Council on. We'll be discussing it in the work session on October 30th. Then we've got the Southwest Corridor Housing Strategy. That is expected to require up to $3 million to leverage additional funds for construction of housing in the Southwest Corridor. It's yet to be determined whether that's a general fund need or not, but I wanted to make sure that was on the list as well.
I think we should have the Outer Powell Division as well, because that we know needs more funding and we don't know where it's coming from.
Great.
And by the way, you list this as other known one-time issues, but the presentation we had on Southwest Corridor Housing Strategy was that a new urban renewal district may be the key to unlocking the resources we need to fund it. So it could be one-time funding, it could be urban renewal, it could be some combination.
Yes, absolutely, and that's really why it's on this slide and not on the previous slide regarding commitments, because it is still something that's in development and determining what the size of the general fund impact is. Let's see. The revenue division of OMF is ready to launch an RFP for a pretty big technology investment. It's an integrated tax system to replace our sort of homebrew legacy system. The costs at this point are very low confidence, so I don't have any numbers up here, but there are a number of options being explored for funding that work, including a possible benefit sharing agreement with the implementer. And finally, I've included the special appropriations competitive grants. This is something that most members of council have expressed a desire to continue, so wanted to make sure that didn't get lost. So I'll stop for any questions, concerns, additions. Obviously, as we move through the process, we'll continue to sift through this list, add to it, cut from it, and figure out what we're going to get done in 1920 and beyond. So as you can see, we've got a lot on our plate. And so we're really looking to you for guidance to know where to focus staff effort and public resources in this process. So Jessica Kennard is going to talk a little bit more about directives to develop, and that's really one of the tools that we're hoping to use to sort of get there.
Before we go on to that, I wanted to follow up on the mayor's comment around trying to delineate the list by commitments that we have to fund no matter what. I was wondering about any other categories that might be helpful for council, because these seem to exist on a spectrum in terms of pre-development, things that we have done as legacy work, work that may be able to be pushed out into out years. Would that be helpful for council if we took a kind of an organizational way to look at, here's the way you could be looking at this in terms of when these could be funded, how they could be funded? I feel like with that question, it just prompted me, we could do a little more detailed scenario work for you there. Would that be helpful? Not all these need to be staged in the same way. Some of them can be done differently. Commissioner Fritz, I can see you're ready.
I'm just challenged. I've had my new bureaus for 1 month. And so this whole discussion, I know there's multiple things that we need to do in the Office of Equity and Human Rights, but I don't know what to put on the table at this point. So I just want to put a placeholder that there are some huge, and I haven't heard from the other bureaus that I am not and have never been in charge of. So that's really challenging to me to say, is this the list?
I would welcome it. I mean, I've been here now, 10 years, and so we've been through enough of these processes where I think I've gotten to the point where I ask the right questions sometimes. But having a multi-year view of when these costs may hit, and also a cheat sheet that gives us options in terms of funding. Like with Southwest, we're looking at urban renewal, potentially other sources, potentially the housing bond, 2 housing bonds, then there's general fund. I think some recognition of the mix of funding that's in play is helpful. At the very least, Tom, the benefit of that is that it ensures that the council is comparing apples to apples. I mean, once you hand out that document, you may get some feedback, critical or otherwise. But I think it's very important that we're all operating on the same set of assumptions about this year's budget and the next couple of years. So I think that's the value. Mm-hmm. And the feedback you get from my colleagues and the feedback that causes you to shape it a little more is valuable. So if it doesn't require a lot of work, which I don't think it will, and it doesn't apply to every one of these, I think it's a good exercise. Right.
Yeah, no, I think
personally,
I think that's precisely where we're looking to head. I think it's one thing that we've been challenged with over the years is teeing up those questions in the current year for how we're going to address some of the out years and how we're going to size and manage those issues and resource them. So I think that kind of sheet and those options would be really useful to start having those conversations earlier, rather than waiting for them to slide up into the current year when we need to deal with them more immediately. So we look forward to that. So now I'll hand it over to Jessica Kennard, who's going to talk a little bit more about the specifics on directives to develop.
Thanks. Good morning, Council. My name is Jessica Kennard. I'm the Interim Assistant Budget Director. I'm going to briefly walk you through the goals of the Direct to Develop process, as well as some of the technical details, and we'll also have time for some questions. One of the key changes to the budget process that's been discussed, as you know, is having the Mayor and Commissioners formally direct the development of investment proposals. This is in contrast to the current process where bureaus independently and individually develop packages and submit them for council consideration at the end of January with their requested budgets. So to start at a high level, the goals of this process, and it is a new process, so these are what the process hopes to achieve, is to increase predictability of the budget process by providing clear and early guidance to bureaus on where council priorities lie. And this is, again, a big reason why we're all here today, and we were here last week, is having this priority setting conversation early. To maximize the value of bureau staff time by focusing staff and public engagement efforts on the thoughtful development of packages in the areas that they know council is prioritizing. So as you know, in the existing process, hundreds of city staff and our public advisory bodies are spending countless hours developing several proposals, the vast majority of which are not accepted in the end. So the thinking here is that with this process, at the very least, bureau staff and their advisory bodies will know that they're spending time working on those areas that are of priority to council. So this is not to say that all directives will be eventually accepted or funded, but the likelihood that that work will be utilized and valuable in some way is much more high. Relatedly, this process should empower council to focus your time and your discussions on those areas that are of most importance to you. Next slide, thank you. So what is a directive to develop? Essentially, it's a council signal for a desired service level outcome to one or more bureaus. What is meant by this is that council may direct bureaus to tell you how to achieve a certain desired outcome, and then let our capable city staff and our capable advisory bodies determine what the widgets are to put together a proposal for you to how to achieve that outcome. So it's allowing leadership to essentially step back, tell folks what you'd like to see, and allow all of our capable civil servants to do the hard work that they have learned to do in putting together a proposal for you. This is not to say that directives to develop can't be something as specific as putting forward a position or directing a bureau to put forward a certain dollar value for outreach or another package. But the idea here is, again, to empower leadership to really talk about the outcomes and the achievements that you want to see, and seeing what bureaus put together in terms of their best foot forward. It will also empower, you can direct more than one bureau to work on a package together. And so we can start to get a little bit more at that cross-city, cross-bureau collaboration. These packages should be communicated in writing with the city budget office copied. CBO will keep track of the directives and work with bureaus to understand the package so we can perform an accurate analysis during our review period. We are also available to assist members of council and bureaus with clarifying the issues, articulating the desired outcomes, and or structuring the package. Understand, again, this is a change. This is a big change for council and for bureaus, so we're here to assist however we may in making sure that the process runs smoothly. And then to ensure that packages meet council's intended goals and priorities, they should be as specific as possible, but as we've heard from council, it's hard, particularly at this early stage, to be very specific. So we can do some further conversations around that. But at the high level, what the directive to develop should include is essentially the issue or problem that you would like to see addressed, the desired outcome of the package that you'd like to see, and then direction on how the package should be funded if desired. That's an option, it's not required, but you do have the option to direct bureaus to request new resources, to look for new revenue sources, and to Commissioner Fish's point, to investigate what other options there might be outside of the general fund to fund a certain priority. You may direct them to look into that. You may also direct them, direct a reallocation, or you may direct new resources as well. Let's see, so next slide. Okay, so when are directives to develop issued? So first I should say that any member of council may issue a directive to develop, and it's essentially why we are having this conversation now. It's starting now, but it's throughout the budget process. So there's a lot of stuff that's changing right now, as Commissioner Fritz mentioned. Several commissioners just have new bureaus. We have a new commissioner coming online in a few months. So we understand, and also during the budget development process, we understand there's a lot of new information that may come to light throughout bureau outreach and education. So the process is really starting now. and you can continue to work on developing your directives over the next couple of months. I will say that to really maximize the value of the and the quality of the packages, it helps for bureaus to have the directives as soon as possible, so that when they submit their requested budget, they have time to provide as comprehensive and thoughtful of a package as possible. But again, understanding that it's always that push and pull between limited time and the information that you all are trying to gather during budget season. Let's see. So. Finally, as a segue to Director Ree's next session on community engagement, these directives may be a helpful tool in improving our public engagement efforts during March and April, but I will let her talk about that a little more. And I imagine there are likely some questions, so I'd like to pause here and see if we can address any of those. Yes?
How does this work with the commission form of government? Supposing I propose a directive for the police bureau, which the mayor as police commissioner says over my dead body, how does that work?
So I think that
The short answer is there's a special file that gets put in.
well, so one of the goals here, and what we want to do is we want to ensure that this new process is as flexible and open as possible, and you all are elected on a citywide basis. So we're trying to facilitate the ability for each commissioner to be able to have a role in overall city governance. The details in terms of how you get beyond one commissioner being essentially the director of bureau would be heavily reliant on conversations amongst commissioners. And so the hope too here would be that those conversations could happen and commissioners could reach some sort of tentative agreement, so that again we know that the bureau is really working on a priority area that's not just a priority for one member of council, but potentially a priority for more than one member of council.
So again, I'm newly in charge of the Office of Equity and Human Rights. There's a lot of stuff to figure out. One of my colleagues comes with something that is not currently on top of my to-do list. I'm then supposed to figure out whether or not that should be top of my to-do list.
So the way that, and again, this process is not finalized yet, I should say, right? So we are opening this up certainly to council decision in terms of hammering out some of the details. But the way that it's currently structured is that you, Commissioner Fritz, or one of your colleagues may request a directive to develop, and if you decide that it's not a priority for you, that you don't want that priority to be funded, you as the commissioner in charge are actually the person that's signing off on that final requested budget. So that would be your opportunity as the commissioner in charge to say, no, thank you, I would rather you not put that forward.
Just seems the opposite of what we're trying to do in terms of making good use of staff time and volunteer time. So, usually we get the presentations from the bureaus. I find out the budget is the one time that I, as a commissioner, do have that citywide authority to look at what gets funded, what doesn't, and therefore what happens in bureaus and what doesn't, with input from each of my colleagues. Yes. And usually we would have the presentations from the bureaus to let us know, here's some hot issues you might not know about in Bureau X. And me thinking, oh my goodness, I thought that was taken care of years ago. Let's absolutely work on that, or else, still not a priority. Yeah. So I just don't, it's putting a lot of work on me as a commissioner to meet with the directors, to have multiple meetings with my colleagues, which isn't transparent behind the scenes. I just am not.
No, what I just want.
I'm wondering about my workload.
Yes.
No, I completely appreciate that, and I think that when I issued the memo to sort of outlining the initial draft of this approach, really highlighted the fact that ultimately this is council's process, and we really are working to we want to make sure that it is a process that that generates the outcomes that you as a group are looking for. I think that we've. I would say that we are trying to problem solve for a certain set of issues. We may be creating other issues that you've identified. But one thing that I would say is, looking back on previous processes, and you've been a part of many. One thing that would be really helpful for us as we kind of dial this in a little bit is to understand how those, how have we navigated those questions of you know, bureaus outside of your portfolio, and I think you've highlighted a couple of those areas where, you know, you've looked to the sort of the surfacing and ventilation of a lot of the priorities that have come up through bureaus as being sort of your window into what might be an appropriate sort of place to put emphasis. So I think that we're going to need to keep working through this. So I'd love to keep working with your office on and other offices on exactly how we can navigate this particular issue, because it's ultimately a question that, you know, the form of government is one that we navigate every day in a lot of different ways, and this is really just going to present a challenge. But I think that given some of the problems that we're solving for on the other end, I think that that there's some real benefits, and so maybe we can figure out a way to really dial in this question of the tension between commissioner in charge versus, you know, citywide elected official. We recognize that that is an ongoing challenge for all of you, and we want to help sort of get to a good process that sort of honors both those roles.
Claudio, sorry, go ahead, Commissioner Daly.
So thank you, Commissioner Fritz, for raising that issue. It hadn't even occurred to me that this meant that we could request directives to develop for bureaus that we're not in charge of, and I found that momentarily quite exciting. Yes, literally endless, yeah. But I can see how it would also be problematic. So, I mean, I'd want to hear all the brilliant ideas from my colleagues, but ultimately I think you would have to have the buy-in from the commissioner in charge for it to advance to deliberation.
So how about we take it back and try and work on this specific problem, come up with some potential solutions, maybe bring them to your staffs to sort of vet those and see if we can come up with a good answer.
I'm not rejecting the idea out of hand, and I think there are some bureaus and some issues that we are all held responsible for, regardless of who is the commissioner in charge, and we should be making collaborative decisions and working across bureaus. I'm just concerned that we could just have this deluge of directives coming from, you know, not the commissioners in charge, and it could get a little out of hand.
No, I think that's absolutely right.
It also sounds kind of fun, to be honest. But
you know, when Tom and I have talked about what does success look like for this process.
So, Claudio, let me give some. First of all, thank you for the effort here, because I see what you're trying to get at writ large, and this is really you trying to operationalize what I put on the table last time we met, which was how do we get earlier engagement. And the reality is that we already have a process where at least the mayor through the proposed budget can do things that the commissioner in charge doesn't approve of, one way or the other. And what I'm trying to also do is get the buy-in as early as possible. I mean, it's not always possible to get complete buy-in, but as much understanding in terms of what my colleagues think are their top priorities, as much as they can do so by the time that the proposed budget has to be issued. I'd rather it not be a big surprise, right? So that requires a lot of lead work. I concur with Commissioner Udaly that, and I think Commissioner Fritz intimated this as well, I don't think, given this form of government, you can really cram it down the throat of a commissioner in charge against their will. I don't think that's a practical solution. But what we're also trying to overcome is last year we had so many proposed ad packages. And what Jessica said rings true to me. We had staff working really, really hard to propose, I forget how many proposed ad packages.
Well over 100, yeah.
Well over 100 ad packages. And how many did we, you know, give or take, how many do you think we actually funded?
Oh, I wouldn't want to guess, but I would expect it was probably 20 to 30.
Okay, so maybe a third-ish, you know, a fifth to a third actually get funded. And I'm not sure that's a great use of staff time. So maybe there's a way to reduce that number, be mindful of the fact that our staffs are working really hard. This is also a pivotal year in that we're moving to a different strategy around budgeting altogether with the program offers. So we're all going to be busy and we're all going to be heads down. But I'm just simply stating a preference. I would really like to have as much input from my colleagues as early as possible in this process. I'm a little put off by the word directives. I think that sounds a little formal.
Direction?
Yeah, direction. Or at least just, I want to make sure I come out of this process, not necessarily today, but in the not distant future, because we're already in the early stages of formulating the proposed budget. People may not realize that. We're already doing the lead work with bureaus. It would be helpful to know more rather than less. And I see that that's what you're trying to get at. So maybe if you could go back and work on a couple of scenarios, that would be helpful.
I think that works, and we can get something to you.
And before we move on to Sook, I just want to mention a couple things. One is I still have concerns about how the budget redesign is going to impact small bureaus, and especially those that are developing capacity in order to accomplish or fulfill council-directed actions. In particular, I'm talking about civic life and OEHR. And then the other question I have, I still, one of my frustrations with the budget process thus far is that it wasn't really inspiring bureaus or commissioners to really dig in and find the inefficiencies and redundancies. And I don't quite see how this redesign is going to allow us to do that.
Do you want to talk to it on that? Sure.
Because directives are another name for ad packages. We're still talking about ad packages. So, yeah, I have a remaining concern.
Commissioner Daly, I have a story that may help.
Okay.
In terms of that. There is a lot of inspiration to do the work of building the budget differently in the bureaus, and I'll use the OMF family of bureaus as an example. I sat at this table last year and answered Rob's question, the community budget advisor, around, we just didn't get to the point early enough to do the OMF budget as one budget. We are doing that this year.
Great.
So with the program offer model, we are challenging our people around, present your program with your performance outcomes. You'll have your constraint, your Cal -1, show us exactly how you'll deliver the performance with that money, and we will make choices across the bureaus around the priorities that council gives us, instead of bureau by bureau by bureau, kind of thinning the soup. So that is a change that I think is very positive. I know similar activities are happening in other bureaus. So we will continue to do a better job telling council about the changes already underway, because I think you identified that we just haven't really told that story about what's happening day to day in the bureaus. I also want to make a point, if that answered your question, on directives to develop. I'm really glad Commissioner Fritz asked the question, because it's been debated by staff around how do we do this in the best way for council and Portlanders. And I want to raise one example that I think is instructive. We know there will be lots of ongoing interest in the Housing Bureau. As a city, we've asked the Housing Bureau to do a lot of new business lines over the last few years. In terms of the capacity that the Housing Bureau has to deliver and fulfill its existing commitments on the bond and other programs, we would hope that in the directives to develop process, interested commissioners would talk to the commissioner in charge and Director Callahan about, should staff actually invest time in developing this directive or direction because of that unique case of that bureau. So we are hoping the process also expands the collegiality and the understanding across the citywide electeds of what's happening in each bureau, particularly on the top priorities. We have tended in the past to not do as good a job as we should do as staff, educating all the council around the management issues within these bureaus that are facing significant pressures as Portland grows, like the Housing Bureau is. So to give you a flavor of our debate, we talked about that around if Commissioner Daly has a directive for the Housing Bureau, should the mayor sign off? Should they talk? Should there be we don't have an easy answer on that. So I think the step is the correct one, that CBO come up with some options for you.
But Tom, we already have a culture that gives us some guidance in this. So for example, it is extremely rare for a commissioner to come to council and offer an amendment without knowing they have a second. And conversely, it's embarrassing not to have a second because there's that deadly quiet that occurs and nothing goes forward. So our entire system is predicated on the idea that we're spending time with our colleagues having these conversations. And I would not look favorably on any directive proposed by a colleague who was not the commissioner in charge, that had not been discussed with the commissioner in charge, that did not have some broad support, and that was not consistent with something that the council had identified as a core priority. That's just my filter, but I think we're all capable of making the same kinds of judgments. And I don't think we should create a system where we're doing end runs around commissioners. I think we should have a system that encourages more collaboration.
So I'll be asking for weekly meetings with everybody. I mean, seriously, this is a lot of work, starting at the top and not engaging the public. So maybe we should get to the public input part of it, because I'm very concerned that it gets overly baked before community members even have a chance to weigh in.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions before we go to Director Ree?
And I just want to say thank you for all of your input on this particular aspect of the process. As Tom mentioned, it has been something that we've discussed a lot at the staff level, and ultimately hearing from council on the way that you want to handle this particular issue is really important for us to move this forward. Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
Good morning again. Zukri, Office of Community and Civic Life. Is that about right? All righty. Oh, is this one better? Now let's put this over here. Good morning. The first slide says concepts worth repeating, and I'm going to use these concepts to frame my remarks to share with you this morning. Many of the things you've highlighted today really point to a multi-year iterative process, not incremental per se, but definitely these ideas take multiple iterations to become successful and useful. Today, I'll spend a little bit of time about some of the focused design improvements for community engagement in the spring, but you'll see that most of my slides are about what we need to do in a longer period of time to truly affect this change. I also want to remind Council that the community engagement process actually has several different end users in mind. Council might be the most important because you're the final decision makers, but bureaus and also communities need other supports and other tools so that they could be full participants. What you're fundamentally doing is actually a leadership proposition. You're changing the conversation. So I just want to take a moment to thank you for insisting that we do that. Your comments, which sometimes maybe we are not able to deliver the right answer as quickly as we'd like to you, your comments and your insistence that we change this process and change the conversation is very welcome, because this is long overdue. The next slide is about changing the conversation. So, are we engaging the community on the right questions? Mayor Wheeler actually spoke to this in his remarks last week, and I'm going to repeat them. I took him down verbatim, and they're worth repeating. He said, we need a citywide discussion about our core obligations as a city government and city council priorities, and to be realistic with the public about the city's scope of control, what we're capable of doing, and our obligations to the public on an ongoing basis. Commissioner Udaley also spoke to the need for an honest accounting of what we want and what we need for everyone. And inherent in such a reckoning is leading with equity. And equity requires an unflinching assessment of how we got here, as well as a non-negotiable focus on outcomes. And so these questions, whether around housing, infrastructure, or livability, is actually a different set of questions we've been engaging the communities around in our annual budgeting process. So I am not going to pretend that the city's, the complexity of the city's budget can be represented in these easy concepts like income statement and balance sheet, but we haven't even really introduced those concepts or presented the information in that way to community members. And these are familiar concepts for anyone in business or nonprofits or organizational life. One is a statement of performance, and the other one is a statement of position. They cover they're different concepts. They cover different timeframes. The community actually needs these tools in the presentation for them to engage in these conversations about trade-offs, and we have not actually been delivering it to them. So we do actually do a very good job at this at some bureaus. And so let's not pretend that we actually don't have success already in the mix, but we don't do this in an aggregate way for the global budget process. And so the way we actually engage our community members is a way that we've trained them to participate in certain ways, so we actually need to provide different mechanisms. So the next slide is about this year's modest improvements. Modest is an operative word here. So there will be some design improvements for the community budget forums, but in this time of so much change, not just in the city budgeting process, but so much change at all different levels throughout the community, the budget forums will offer a measure of predictability. So there will be changes to the format and possibly to the timing and to the number of them, but these modest changes reflect primarily the timing of the conversation we're having now and our new partnership with CBO. These are new roles and relationships for Civic Life as well as CBO. So changes to the format might include bringing back what Commissioner Fish called the skinny version of Budget 101. We've done this in the past. CBO has done this in the past. I believe last year was 1 year we did not. And we could also maintain, as Commissioner Fritz has requested, to maintain the direct opportunity not to just talk to other community members, but directly to council members, because that is very important. But how we have those conversations might be organized around the, what are we calling them now, direction or suggestions to develop, as well as randomly by lottery. So we can have more focused conversations if we have exercised restraint in the number of directions to develop, then that could be reflected in the community engagement process on the forum side. We also know that we want to solicit less heard perspectives in different ways. We actually need to go out and solicit and get perspectives that will not come through the forums and that are not presented through the backs. And so I'll speak to that a little bit later. We also want to remember that another end user are the Bureau Advisory Committees. And just as Commissioner Udaley just pointed out, small bureaus and large bureaus and revenue and general fund bureaus have different needs. We need to better understand the questions coming from bureaus and the Bureau Advisory Committees in order to help them with the implementation. So the next slide is about changes to come in a multi-year fashion. So asking our end users is not something we've done in quite a while. So of course, we'll go back to communities, and we also will go back to Bureau Advisory Committees about what is most useful. Communities actually might want to weigh in on different things or have ways to understand different things. They might want to know not just what to cut or add, but why things cost as much or as little as they do, or if investing in X has led us to Y, as promised in previous years, or why some council priorities come with money and some do not. So we can't presume what they will want to know and need to participate, but we need to ask. And then we also need to acknowledge that these needs will need to be addressed maybe outside of the annual budgeting process. So I'm going to ask to go to the next slide. In the coming years, we actually need year-round and multi-level communications and opportunities for engagement. We need actually community engagement that educates and informs, as well as provides mechanisms for input and advice, as well as advocacy and lobbying. And they're really different. They're very different, and we need to actually bring back year-round communications or add about and actually help people really understand the bigger picture. We actually need to do a lot of myth busting. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and they come to play at Bureau Advisory Committees and at budget forums. And we actually need to, as was expressed in at last week's session, people want to come back. I've heard council say we want to come back to the community and tell them what we achieved with the decisions that were made, especially reflecting community input.
So I have my favorite myths that need to be busted, but give us some examples of what you're talking about.
Well, let's see. There's so many good ones.
Let me throw one out that consumed a budget conversation we had a few years ago, which was the idea that all of our reserves could be tapped to invest in new services. And it was a very seductive argument, that was brought to our community forums. And people then started thinking we had all this money that was just sitting around and weren't put to good use. And of course, we were talking about the reserves that we have that in turn earn us a AAA credit rating, and most of them are capital reserves, so they can't be tapped. But frankly, it was a very difficult set of myths to unwind because it appeared to solve a problem at no cost. So that was an example for me of something that potentially hijacked a budget process and was not very helpful, and it was a myth that needed to be busted.
Very good. Do you have another myth?
Yeah, no, I think the idea that there are easy cuts lying around, I think, is one of the ones that I think we need to dispel. Efficiencies are difficult to generate. They may be worthwhile in the end, but they have operational costs in the short term in order to get there. And so ultimately, when we're talking about reductions, we're not talking about finding the fat and getting rid of it. We're talking about diminishing levels of service, and we need to be clear with the public about what those impacts are, but also be clear about what the breadth of services that we still do provide, and why we're selecting some lower level of service in order to fit within the existing revenue constraint.
And then some of these myths or misinformation are actually artifacts of our own practice. If we keep asking communities, what do you want, anything, and we have 100 ad packages, and then we actually cannot fund them, that actually creates another myth about what we actually can or cannot do as a city. So this changing the conversation and focusing on opportunities as well as strategic long-term investments actually will help change the context in which some of these things come up. The next slide actually speaks to methodological rigor. Thank you, Commissioner Fish, for stating last week that you would like to see more scientifically sound methods of engagement. So would we. There's for example, I'm just going to it says on the slide, our come one, come all methods do not ensure equitable participation and outcomes. And you know this from your own experience, and you don't need a study to tell you, but I'm going to share one with you. So there's a new study just released in June of this year by political scientists associated with Boston University's initiatives on cities. And the study is titled, Who Participates in Local Government? And their analysis was of participation in issues, in their case, of zoning and housing is a priority issue for this council in Massachusetts between 2015 and 17. So their study explored how institutions designed to encourage and empower neighborhood participation in local politics can distort the distribution of influence. And again, we know that we've all experienced this. And so, for example, it's not just who speaks at forums, but just the profiles of actually who participates and who shows up in the first place is different than that of the general public. They tend to be, in this study and in many studies, disproportionately male, more politically active, more affluent, and homeowners. The study also showed that the general support for certain issues does not always translate into public forums. So, for example, a community could have demonstrated broad support for, in this case, affordable housing, but at the public forums, the comments do not reflect that. And so the incentives to show up and the reality of who participates the most are often predictable. And we don't need to discount these incentives or these perspectives. We just need to acknowledge and understand them. And that's why it's imperative that we actually, if our goal is actually to gather a meaningful and statistically representative range of perspectives, then we actually have to pursue different methods for ensuring that. So we can and we will change the format of the BACs and the budget forums because they are necessary, but they're not sufficient. So lastly, I think this is maybe my last slide, the next slide.
Interject here. This is a really important point for me because as we saw in the budget forums earlier this year, we had one community almost completely overtaking a forum plan for East Portland, and people were literally shut out of the room and couldn't come in to give testimony about issues pertinent to East Portland, which is it's an area of Portland that we are trying to better serve. And I love the idea of the distortion of the distribution of influence, because being able to turn out in huge numbers does not mean that your issue is the most vital issue before council. And we're not taking a popular vote on our budget. And I want us to take a lot of responsibility for that dynamic, because we just have not given the public the tools that they need, like you said, the balance sheet, and to meaningfully participate. So that's a really big one for me. I do not want to sit through another budget forum like the ones we had earlier this year.
And the last slide is around those tools. Our annual budget presentation can be changed, and CBO is outstanding when they're asked to deliver a different type of presentation, a different way to to share information. They can. I think we just need to actually use community input process to help CBO and our city to actually create those tools together. Transparency Transparency does include putting hundreds of pages of our budget information on our website, but understanding requires a different type of presentation. So the community also needs a dashboard similar to all of the things that council has requested today. What is the ongoing list? What does that look like organizationally? What stages of development? They don't have to be the same, but the community also deserves those set of tools so they can engage in those long-term trade-off conversations with you that you so want. And lastly, we don't need to do it alone. We have a lot of great talent in the city, but there's a lot of great talent in our academic institution, our professional disciplines. We haven't consulted them in a while about how to improve our community engagement processes, especially for the budgeting. We also have a body, the Public Involvement Advisory Committee, that we have started the conversation with just last week after the work session about their role, an ongoing role. And again, I'll go back to the end users. We need to do a different type of consultation. We've heard some and much of what commissioners need, but we could use some methodological rigor to assessing what bureaus, BACs, communities, and council needs. Then the last slide, because I said they're worth repeating, I'm going to repeat them again. I'm just going to show the concepts worth repeating.
I have a couple of just comments. Take them for what they're worth, which is probably not a whole lot. Number one, who is the community? Number two, to what degree does and should our budget reflect the interests of the community? Question three, are we simply reflecting the desired budget priorities of the community, or are we also elected to exert leadership in certain areas that maybe aren't seen as broad community priorities? Number four, and this gets to the statistically significant issues. I've always wondered why we don't do more polling, just to find out what the public actually thinks. You know, you ask them, what are their top three priorities for the city of Portland? When you think about living or working or playing in the city of Portland, what are the top three things you're expecting from your local government? Where am I? Number four, number five, whatever. Five. I would venture to guess that the vast majority of people never want to come to a public forum. And I had one person describe the environment at one of our public forums last year as hostile and unsafe. And if that's the case, then we are definitely not, and it was not Commissioner Udaley. And you know, so that, I mean, let's just be honest. If electeds are involved and you're having a town hall, it's going to be heated. That's just the environment in which we're in. And that's not necessarily a very good environment for people to come and share their thoughts about what their priorities are, particularly if they think their priorities might be divergent from the majority of people who happen to be participating in that forum at that moment in that location. So I think we have to be a lot smarter than this. Because if we want thoughtful input, that's one thing. But it's really easy to turn a forum into a flash mob. and that's a completely different thing. So these are just
Let me-
questions I'm thinking about.
Let me add on to that. There was a risk last year that the entire premise of our community budget forums was undermined by groups that came in rejecting the whole exercise and reframing our budget as a fight between austerity and new investments. And while I think people have a right to organize around those issues, I think the complication for us is that we're looking for guidance as if we're living within a constrained environment. And we have to do both. We have to give people the right to say, I reject your framework, new revenue, and cover everything. But we also have to frame the conversation that's helpful to us around priorities. So that's a challenge. And some of the better organized and most vocal groups last year rejected the whole premise of our budget conversation. So the information we got wasn't all that helpful. I wholeheartedly agree with the mayor, we need to do some polling. One of the things you learn in this job is that there is this huge gap between the level of sophistication that we see in how campaigns are run here, both candidate campaigns and ballot measures, and then the way that we do survey work. And the auditor's annual survey was not a very rigorous exercise. It did show trends. It had the advantage of showing trends, so you could see if there was a drop-off or an increase. But you could pretty much set your clock around the fact that firefighters in parks got high marks, and there was some ambivalence about other things. And it was just, as it was predictable and not very helpful. And then as, in the recession, people's views about government declined a little bit because services got degraded. Over time, with the declining trust, you see numbers come down a little bit, but not as much as I would have expected. We're still over 50%, of positive ratings, which is extraordinary in these times when Congress is in single digit. But it really wasn't very helpful. So Mayor, I would hope we'd go beyond having this conversation about polling and just carve out some money and have get to the work of doing a pretty sophisticated poll, scientific poll, that helps identify priorities. And maybe we can, as a group, come up with some of the, we don't want the council drafting collectively a poll. There's that joke about a horse designed by a committee is a camel. We have to be careful that there's actually some strategic guidance and that we have a expert that is helping us figure this out. But I second your polling. The third request I have, Director, is I know, at least for me personally, and I'm sure for some of my colleagues, there are going to be some potential conflicts on dates for public hearings. So I would say the sooner we get notice of potential dates with flexibility, there are some dates I just can't sign on to. So I want that opportunity early on to say, those days don't work, can we do it? Because I would like to be at every forum. But I think each of us is going to have some conflicts. And the sooner we get a proposed schedule, again, with some flexibility, recognizing that Mondays and Fridays are generally out, and that for some of us, there's particular constraints every 2 weeks we have to build in. I would appreciate that so that we can make sure we have a full council in attendance.
So I'm going to be the voice of dissent when it comes to polling. I personally didn't use polling in my campaign. It worked out fine for me. And, just to continue to use myself as an example, there were polls that showed me, coming in 8th in my group of candidates for my position. So if we were to use polling, I would want to be sure that we weren't just polling people who happen to be home and still have landlines, because that certainly represents a distortion of opinion in the community. I think I really struggle with the balance between representative and participatory democracy. I am a fan of participation, but we were elected by majority of the voters for a reason, and it's because they felt we would best represent their interests. And I think as elected representatives, we at least have to set the priorities and then allow community members to help us hash out the details. I know when we get public input, what I'm most concerned with is, are we reaching the most vulnerable and the most underserved communities. Because we've done a pretty good job serving people who are doing just fine. I don't know that, well, I do know that we haven't done a great job serving the most vulnerable. Are the priorities we've set really the most urgent matters the city is facing? Unintended consequences is something that comes up a lot, and I think it's vital to hear from community members about that, because as we are seeking to serve vulnerable and underrepresented communities or to create remedies for historic wrongs, we can have a tendency to overcompensate or continue to not consider all of the variables and fail to accomplish our goals. So that's what I'm most concerned about when we hear from the community. I think we have to be able to lead on a lot of this.
Can I just respond? Because I think I actually agree with you to the extent, I think candidate polling and issue polling are different. I've never polled in 4 primaries, and I've won 4 primaries with over 50% of the vote. So I've never invested one dime in a poll. And the poll that you relied on and I rely on is being out in the public, talking to people, putting together a platform, and then seeing how it sells. I mean, that's ultimately. But candidate campaigns turn on so many other variables: likability, the quality of the campaign, issues that resonate with the public at that particular historical moment. There's so many variables that kick in. I will contrast that with the housing bond campaign that's being done regionally. Some of the survey work that I've seen that really drills down into what do people think about affordable housing and what's important to them, and if they had an extra dollar to spend, where might they put it, those kinds of things. I find those fascinating because I don't really have a clue where people are on that. And the science really drills down into, into communities however you want. So I agree with you. I'm more skeptical about the candidate polling. I agree with you that we have to be very clear about how we reach people, because the least reliable poll in the world is the one that we get in the Tribune on a regular basis, which is where they just call people with electronic messages and ask them to do something. It disproportionately skews older, whiter, and more wealthy. And by the way, when's the last time you ever answered a poll when someone had a recorded message like that? I mean, I do what most of us do, which is I hang up. And plus, you're not going to reach people like my daughter that are engaged voters unless you have her cell phone number. So conceding all of that, I think it's more valuable in issue areas because it gives us a sense of where the public is on stuff. And I think sometimes we hear the noisiest coalition, but we also aren't listening to the broadest voices in the community. And I think that's where issue polling is more valuable than candidate polling.
Yeah, I don't disagree. It's just they've really proven to be pretty unreliable, and I'm concerned with who we're reaching.
Yep.
They're great if we're reaching a truly diverse representative group.
Yeah, no, so I think that all of those issues of representation, distortion of voices, et cetera, are some of the issues that my team has been working through as we develop the Community Insight Survey for this year. This is restarting sort of what the auditor was doing for many years and trying to address some of the concerns that Council has talked about here today and been talking about for several years. So just hearing this conversation, it makes me realize the urgency that we get to your offices to really understand what are you looking for in this. Michelle Rubin in my office is running this project. We're looking to go out for an RFP for somebody who has the background in scientific survey work and has the expertise in addressing some of these concerns. So would really love to get additional feedback on some specific areas, specific questions that folks would like to be asked, and other areas.
So yeah, I remember we did put that in the budget, so I'm glad that we're going to do it.
And I will take this conversation as a directive to develop the ongoing component of that, because it is a one-time item in this year's budget.
I love polling. I love doing it and answering them.
So Oh, I'm sorry.
Really, somebody's asking my opinion. Absolutely. Let me tell you. If we wait till the budget process to do this robust community engagement, we've waited too long. And so essentially we need to have representative bureau advisory committees in every bureau that really understand on an ongoing basis, what does the bureau do, what are the needs, what are the opportunities, and who are we talking to, how are we structuring those, how are we getting public input at those. And again, I believe our process should be grassroots up and helping people engage with each other in the community so that we have a better understanding when we get to the budget process.
Can I just add one comment? The first question you asked, Mayor Wheeler, is who is the community? That is actually a very fundamental question because there is data for that, but it's not entirely accurate. But who is the community now and who is the community that we're becoming? Those are actually two different trajectories. They look really different. The community that we're becoming, you look at the classroom of a David Douglas School District elementary classroom, and that's the community we're becoming. It looks really different than the community we are today. And so you also asked about your role. Really, it's a leadership role of saying where should we put our strategic focus and where do we make those choices. And thank you, Commissioner Udaley, for saying, and I feel like it would be irresponsible for us as any civil servant to not make those choices with equity in mind, because we know our history and we know what it takes nothing to uphold current trajectories. It takes everything to actually address them. So, and then my last comment about polling is it'll be the right tool for the right person, for the right set of folks, subset of folks, for the right issue. We can't over-rely on polling as the methodology, as we cannot over-rely on focus groups or anything else. So, as Commissioner Fritz said earlier, this does make your job harder. So thank you for insisting that we do this, and thank you for your leadership in doing it. But you will begin to receive information in different formats and different channels all throughout the year, and it does make your job a little bit harder, but ultimately, long term, perhaps it makes it a little bit easier as well. So,
yeah, that's a really good point, Director Reed. That there's no magic tool here. It's some combination of tools, and then ultimately, I think it comes down to the council using their good judgment. I've had a very skewed 2 days. I often listen to what people say when they call my office, and I understand that electeds' phone lines tend to be complaint-driven, but it's one good reference point on what's going on in the community and what people are particularly anxious about. But we've been flooded with calls in the last 2 weeks because I've apparently become a favorite target of Breitbart, and I'm sort of grateful for that. That tells me I'm probably on the right track. But we're getting lots and lots of calls from people who are very, very upset with regard to my alleged policies around public safety. They've got it, of course, completely wrong, but that's beside the point. But if I listened to those voices, I would be making bad decisions based on heavily biased information that they are receiving. And so I have to put that through the filter, and ultimately this council will have to put a lot through the filter to be able to decide what the right question is. So when I was asking who is the community, maybe a better way to have asked that is who are we listening to and why? And are there voices that we're not hearing? And are there ways that as we think about what tools that we want to use to help us develop this process and ensure that we're hearing those voices, how do we identify what those voices are? And how do we get that feedback? And for different people, different groups, different places, it might require different tools. So I appreciate your going through that. Tom, we're getting close to the hour.
We are. We're moving into next steps. And before Director Campuzano runs through a list, I just want to make a couple comments. One, there are lots of strong leaders behind us in the audience here and listening who are putting a lot of faith in us. And really, this is an exercise in trust, all the budget changes we are trying to do. We want to make sure you know that we are working very hard with people at all levels of the organization to understand it's a multi-year process. It's not going to be perfect. we're doing our best to give you the best options that we can give you in terms of the budget decisions. And particularly with this discussion on community engagement, we know we're going to make some changes this year, but we're going to have to keep making improvements over the next few years. In that spirit, we hope you will be direct with us here and in the following weeks about the results of these 2 work sessions. As we shape up the follow-up, we will follow up with your teams. We will follow up directly with you. We ask you to trust us that we will make incremental changes this year, but please just continue to be as frank as you have been. I think we're going to make a lot of progress. With that, I'll hand it over to Claudio.
Well, Tom, before you go, let me say that, we're sort of making this up as we go along. And I kicked off the Parks Back process this morning. I've asked the Parks Bureau, the Parks Board, to be our back this year with some additional members folded in. And I said, this is a year of experimentation. We're gonna try to do something different, and we're gonna make some mistakes, and we're gonna learn together. But let's do our best to work within this framework. I will tell you honestly, I did not find the Farver report very helpful or illuminating, but that's not what this is about, and I want to be very clear, speaking for myself. The mayor has, and you have crafted with others, an alternative approach to the budget. And the council has said, we're going to buy into this because we hit a trough last year. We hit an all-time low, and it was a budget a season that was not helpful and was not productive, in my opinion. So this is a leap of faith into trying something differently. We're necessarily asking our budget advisory committees to sort of work with us as we design this thing, because it's not set, and it's gonna evolve organically. But what I can tell you is that the people I'm talking to are excited about trying something different. They're excited about some of these changes. I'm excited just about some of the almost cosmetic things, about having the commissioner in charge back with the bureau director presenting. I think the idea of having the commissioner's office sign off on ad packages will avoid the confusion we had last year about whether certain things were bureau-driven or commissioner-driven. There's a number of changes already, and frankly, I think our public involvement process was so poor in the last couple of years that, frankly, if we did any of the things that are proposed here, it's going to be an improvement. So I'm excited, but I also recognize we're not going to get it fully right this year. It's a work in progress, but I hope over the next few years we land on something that not only helps us craft a better budget, but gives the public a sense of confidence that they're being heard and engaged properly. So that's my litmus test.
Great. So just before I jump into next steps, I just wanted to say that I've heard leap of faith, work in progress. These are definitely descriptors of what we're doing here, and we really appreciate your engagement in this process. Ultimately, as I've said before, this is council's process. It is, and so we are really working to give you something that works better for you and for the city. And I just wanted to give my thanks to Tom and Director Rhea. It has been an absolute pleasure to be working on this project with them and to have such great thought leaders, particularly in community engagement, an area where we know that as green eye shade folks, it's not exactly our area of expertise. And so to have that thought leadership in that area, extremely, extremely valuable. So thank you to all of you. So just wanted to jump in with some next steps. I've got, there were a couple of items that for the list that we put out there, add to that list. Then we also are going to come back with some proposals on how to address directives to develop particularly, or direction to develop particularly across bureau portfolios. We are going to try and put together a multi-year look on some of these big issues and some problem solving on how to bite some of those issues off a little bit more slowly over time, and how that sort of can lay out. Let's see. We are definitely going to talk to your offices with regard to the community insight survey that we're working on to make sure that incorporates all of the areas that you as a council are looking for to hear from the public. And we will definitely work to get those forum dates on the calendar as soon as possible. Is there anything that I missed?
I was just wondering, when are you moving to parks?
The big reveal.
I'm pretty sure that was something
No,
that's already been announced.
No, absolutely, it has been announced. I will be leaving my position very shortly and be taking.
So I just want to, I just want to acknowledge, I want to thank you for your steering the ship in the interim after Director Scott left, and wish you all the best in Parks. Thank you for your work.
Great, thank you. It's been absolutely my privilege to lead the team, especially during this very difficult change, but I think really worthwhile change. So thank you.
I want to thank all of you for the presentation and just put a plug in as we're developing this new community engagement process that we eventually look at consistent community engagement across all of the bureaus and looking at whether we can bring that in-house and perhaps services provided by Civic Life, because I will say I periodically hear from constituents that feel that we've done a terrible job on community engagement when Civic Life has had nothing to do with it, but there's this assumption that because it's community engagement, it's coming from Civic Life. And I don't like being blamed for things that my bureau and my office are not responsible for, because there's plenty of things to blame us for that we are. Thank you.
Great.
First of all, I want to thank you all for the presentation. There were some very good provocative conversations. Tom, I would like it if CBO would, I guess I shouldn't tell it, who's in charge? Claudio for the next?
I'm in charge for another couple of days.
Good, so I'm going to tell you, I'm not sure if we're ready to make announcements yet in terms of your replacement, and so I won't until I'm prompted to do so, but I would like CBO to write a summary memo to the council just to keep these discussions moving forward and deepen our understanding of some of the trade-offs that we face throughout this process, and it sounds like you're already on that. Number two, Tom, I'd like the general fund bureau directors to work with you to develop a few scenarios. And again, we're talking broad-based scenarios based on some of the economic forecasts that we heard. And this is information, obviously, they will want to share with their commissioners, but I want to get the process going and start putting at least some broad brackets around the process as we begin our work on the proposed. Finally, I know that our Chief Financial Officer, Jennifer Cooperman, who's hiding over there by the novelty-sized clock, is working on revising some of our financial policies. And I'm interested in seeing options for ways that we could provide more consistency around dedicating one-time resources to truly one-time needs. And I know that's been an ongoing concern, and I know you're working on some policies, and I'd like to just continue to further that work in tandem with the work that we're doing here on the budget. Anything else for the good of the order? Without further ado, we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.